Okay, so get ready because this deep dive, well, it's going to get a bit dark. We're traveling back in time thousands of years to a Bronze Age mystery in England that's fascinating and chilling. It all starts about 4,000 years ago in a cave system called Charterhouse Warren in Somerset. Now, you'd think the Bronze Age would be pretty peaceful, right? Farming, maybe a little pottery on the side. But it turns out things weren't always so idyllic. Back in the 1970s, cavers found a bunch of bone fragments hidden in these caves, and for decades, those fragments just sat there. But recently, scientists have been able to analyze them with new technology. And what they found, well, it definitely wasn't evidence of a peaceful Bronze Age picnic. To help us make sense of it all, we have our expert here.
So what makes this discovery so striking is that we're not talking about a few random bones here and there. We're talking at least 37 people, a whole community, wiped out in a single event. And it gets worse because the evidence shows that they weren't just killed, they were systematically dismembered. The cut marks on the bones are consistent with butchery. I mean, if we saw these marks on animal bones, we wouldn't hesitate to call it butchery.
Okay, that's a pretty chilling thought. I'm getting some serious Indiana Jones vibes, but darker. So if we're talking about a massacre on this scale, the big question is why? Was this some kind of Bronze Age turf war?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. Usually when we look at other sites from this period, we see signs of conflict, fortifications, weapons, things like that. But here at Charterhouse Warren, there's nothing like that. So this wasn't about territory or resources, and something much more personal and sinister was going on.
Okay, so if it wasn't about land or treasure, what was it about? Did they just have a really bad pottery class and things got out of hand?
Well, keep in mind that this was a time when honor and revenge were really important to society. Imagine a world where a simple insult could escalate into a blood feud. As Professor Schulting, the lead archaeologist on this project, said, this was not a homicidal maniac. This is a community of people that came together to do this to another community.
Okay, now that sends chills down my spine. So we're talking about a complete societal breakdown fueled by revenge. What could have driven these people to such extremes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? We can only speculate. Maybe there was some long-standing dispute over something like grazing rights or a marriage gone wrong. But whatever it was, it clearly sparked a wave of violence that's really unprecedented for this period. Remember, before this discovery, we'd only identified about 10 other victims of violence from this entire era.
Wow, so this completely changes our view of the Bronze Age. We thought it was a relatively peaceful time, but now we're finding evidence of a massacre that's up there with some of the most brutal events in human history. It makes you wonder, are we really that different today? I mean, think about how quickly things can get out of control online. Could something like this happen in our modern world?
That's a great question and one that we'll dig into further. But let's go back to the cave for a minute. We have this horrifying scene, a whole community wiped out. What happened next? Did the attackers just pack up and go home?
Yeah, did they just say, well, that's that. Guess we'll have a celebratory feast now? I mean, were there any consequences for their actions?
It's tough to say for sure what happened right after. Archaeology can only tell us so much. But knowing what we know about Bronze Age societies, it's highly unlikely that this event just vanished into thin air. Imagine the shock and fear that must have rippled through nearby communities. This wasn't just a crime. It was a complete destruction of their social order.
Yeah, it's like a Greek tragedy, a cycle of revenge fueled by grief and anger. So did these events lead to even bigger conflicts, or were there ways to bring things back to order?
Well, think about it. For a society to work, there have to be some rules everyone agrees on even back then. So alongside that desire for revenge, there would have been a ton of pressure to stop the violence from spreading out of control. Maybe elders or religious figures stepped in to mediate, or they had some system of payments to try and settle the score. Whatever it was, we can be pretty sure they would have wanted to find some kind of balance to get things back to normal.
That makes sense, but one thing that's so disturbing is the sheer brutality. The cut marks on the bones, it's hard to imagine the kind of rage that would make someone do that. It's almost like they were trying to wipe out the victims completely, not just physically, but from memory, too.
You've hit on a really important point. This kind of extreme violence often goes along with dehumanization.
Yeah.
When you see your enemy as less than human, as a monster, it becomes easier to justify doing cruel things. Sadly, we see this pattern throughout history.
And that's maybe the most unsettling parallel to our world today. We like to think we've evolved past that kind of tribal thinking, but then you see how quickly people can turn on each other. Online and offline, all it takes is a perceived threat, a difference of opinion, and suddenly someone becomes the enemy.
It's a harsh reminder that for all our technology, we're still vulnerable to the same basic instincts, the same fears and prejudices that drove our ancestors. But the good news is that we also have the capacity for empathy, for understanding, for building bridges instead of walls.
Good point. So as we're dealing with this dark chapter from the Bronze Age, is there anything we can learn from it? Besides maybe avoiding those intense pottery classes?
Absolutely. I think the biggest takeaway is the importance of perspective. We tend to look back on the past with rose-colored glasses, imagining these simple, peaceful communities. But the truth is, history is messy. It's complicated and often brutal. This discovery at Charterhouse Warren really shatters that image of a peaceful past. It makes us face the dark side of human nature, that potential for violence that exists even in societies that seem civilized.
So you're saying we shouldn't romanticize the past, but isn't there some value in looking back at history and trying to find inspiration learning from the people who came before us?
Of course,
Mm.
there's so much we can learn from studying history, but we need to approach it with an open mind, willing to see both the good and the bad, the triumphs and the tragedies. That's the only way to really understand the complexity of humanity and maybe avoid making the same mistakes.
That makes a lot of sense. So we've got this massacre, this explosion of violence in a time and place that we thought was peaceful. But societies don't just fall apart after something like this, do they? People find ways to pick up the pieces and move on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's another important point, the resilience to the human spirit.
Mm.
Even facing unimaginable tragedy, people find a way to rebuild, to adapt, to find meaning in the middle of chaos.
It's like that saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But in this case, it seems like a lot of people were killed. So how did the survivors manage to create a new normal after something so horrific?
Well, remember, this was a time when community was everything. Your survival depended on your connection to the group. So after this massacre, there would have been a strong need to heal, to rebuild that sense of safety and belonging.
So maybe that's the most hopeful part of the story. Even when faced with incredible brutality, humans have an amazing ability to heal, to forgive, to start over. But it takes effort, right? It doesn't just happen automatically.
You're right. It takes courage to face the darkness, to acknowledge the pain, and to choose hope over hatred.
Okay, so we've talked about the brutality, the breakdown of society, the potential for revenge. But what about the people who did it? Did they just vanish into the night? Was there any sense of justice, any accountability for what they did?
It's impossible to know for sure what happened to those individuals. But in these tight-knit Bronze Age communities, it's unlikely they escaped the consequences of their actions.
So you're saying there would have been some kind of social reckoning, like maybe they were banished from the community or faced some kind of tribal punishment?
It's definitely possible.
Hmm.
Remember, social norms were incredibly powerful back then. Violating those norms, committing such a horrific act of violence, would have serious repercussions.
It makes you wonder, did they regret what they did? Did they understand the long-term consequences of their actions?
Well, that's a question we can't answer definitively, but it's certainly a question worth pondering, because it speaks to the very heart of what it means to be human, to grapple with the consequences of our choices, and to strive to create a world where such violence is unthinkable.
That's a powerful thought and a perfect note to end on. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Bronze Age. This discovery at Charterhouse Warren is a stark reminder that even in the midst of darkness, there's always hope. A hope that we can learn from the past and build a better future. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking the stories that connect us all.
Well, that's a question we can't answer definitively, but it's certainly a question worth pondering,
Yeah.
because it speaks to the very heart of what it means to be human, to grapple with the consequences of our choices, and to strive to create a world where such violence is unthinkable.
It's hard to imagine carrying that kind of collective guilt, especially in such a close-knit community. But thinking about it all, it's incredible how archaeology can unearth not just bones and artifacts, but entire chapters of human experience. It really makes us ask some tough questions about ourselves.
Exactly. And this discovery at Charterhouse Warren isn't just about the Bronze Age, it's about us. It's a mirror reflecting some uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the potential for violence. That exists in every society, in every era.
It's almost like a wake-up call. We like to think we're so advanced with our technology and global connections, but this story reminds us that we're not that far removed from those primal instincts.
It is humbling, isn't it? But it's also empowering, because by understanding the past, by really grappling with these dark chapters, we gain a deeper understanding of the forces that shape us.
Okay, so we've explored the darkness, the brutality, the potential for revenge, but amidst all that, there's also a glimmer of hope, right? The fact that these communities found ways to rebuild, to move forward, suggests that. Even after such horrific events, there's a capacity for healing, for resilience.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this story so compelling. It's not just a tale of violence and destruction. It's also a testament to the human spirit, our ability to adapt, to overcome adversity, to find meaning and purpose, even in the face of unimaginable loss.
It's like that phoenix rising from the ashes, a powerful symbol of renewal. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Bronze Age and this chilling discovery at Charterhouse Warren, what's the key takeaway for our listeners? What can we learn from this journey into the past?
I think the biggest lesson here is that history is not just a collection of dates and facts. It's a tapestry woven from the lives, choices, and experiences of countless individuals. And by studying that tapestry, by examining both the light and shadow threads, we gain a richer understanding of who we are, where we've come from, and perhaps most importantly, where we're going.
Beautifully put. So to our listeners out there, we leave you with this thought. The past may be a foreign country, but it's also a reflection of ourselves. And by exploring its complexities, its triumphs and tragedies, we can gain insights that illuminate our present and perhaps even guide us toward a more peaceful, more compassionate future. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep seeking the stories that connect us all.